So thank you very much, Alistair. So a bit of history, also rather surprising. I mean, Osler was a remarkable man, and he appeared to go through life with virtually no enemies, which is very impressive for somebody who was at high level, as he was, on both sides of the Atlantic. So who was this man? He was a Canadian. We'll hear more about his US story this afternoon. But he's remembered by those who know about him as a pioneer of the controversial idea of bedside teaching. In the old days, you might have had 1 year at medical school. For example, Conan Doyle had 1 year, and then you became an apprentice out with somebody, or perhaps two. Usually lectures, maybe the occasional post-mortem, and that was about it. But he thought medical students should see patients before they left the institution. And not only that, but he thought that the senior people should be involved, and he himself would teach 3 times a week. He came in on Sundays to do ward rounds. And there are lots of aphorisms, but many of these remain very relevant. It was being focused. It was being honourable. Medicine's tough in those days. What you could offer for serious illnesses, much less in these days, so be able to bear that well. Listening to the patient. Sounds rather odd to say, but he thought that was a rather good idea. But he was also very keen on the idea of the team rather than being somebody in isolation. Now, I'm a clinical pharmacologist, as are several people in the room. He was very keen on the idea of rational medicine. And he was well aware that doctors love to prescribe. Lots of reasons for doing that. And his view was much better to treat the whole patient and care for them well. And in those days, forget about quiet medicines and give good care, including good nursing care. The question, of course, is how on earth do you make sure these young medical students who've had a year or two of education, how do they learn this and how do they keep up to date? And before he left the US to be Regius Professor in Oxford, he put down a marker on what was not happening at the time, but what he thought was very important. That's to say, the idea of long-term postgraduate study, to remind people about what was standard, what was good, and also to make them aware of good new ideas. And with that end in mind, when he came to Oxford, this was his amazing Victorian house, a lot of rooms, guest rooms. It was known as the Open Arms. And he would have hundreds of people would come through this from around the world, as well as throughout the UK, to visit him. And in the course of this, he made sure that these people met each other, they taught seniors and juniors, and they became a very important network for him in many ways. And he was also very keen in the idea of having access to books. He made sure that the visitors could access his library very easily. He left a huge legacy in the US of this. We'll hear a bit more about his interest in books later on today. And one of the reasons he remained well known beyond a major textbook was subsequent professors of medicine stayed in his house, protected his library, and expanded it to some of those names you may recognize. Pickering in the field of hypertension, Dole, epidemiology, smoking as cause of cancer, and John Moulton was a famous professor of neurology. So on the detail, he was very good at thinking of something and making it happen. And he was aware there was a huge potential wealth of teaching material, good clinicians, and many patients available in London. He was also very keen on the idea of medical societies being a good way for people to keep up to date. Now, as background, Osler came to the UK in 1905, and in the course of his time here, of course, key world event was the World War. And there were two consequences of that, of course. There were many medical people who went to the front to help, and they forgot their civilian skills. They became good at battlefield medicine as much as you could be, but they needed to be reminded of what they should be doing back in civilian practice, and also many very injured patients to look after. So before the First World War, he started what became our organization initially as a postgraduate medical association, of which he was president. And during the war, he was very important at bringing doctors from around the old colonies, as well as around the UK, to help to work at frontline hospitals from Canada, USA, Australia, and so on. And to help educate and re-educate these people coming back, he went on to found what was called the Inter-Allied Fellowship of Medicine, and merged the two societies. He was president of both. He became president of the Joint Society, and this became the Fellowship of Postgraduate Medicine. And you can see below where we currently have our offices, just next to Oxford Circus, a building with rooms and lecture theatre, meeting rooms, and so on. So what was this fellowship, this alliance? He put together a general committee of 73 of the great and the good senior doctors from around London and largely the south of England, from 50 general specialist hospitals willing to help with training. This included representatives from the British Army Medical Services, but also from UK Dominions and from USA. And tactically, he was keen to involve the Royal Society of Medicine, which then was a consortium of many different societies. Their president, Humphrey Rolleston, joined him to help make this work. And interestingly, one of his inter-allied doctors was a Colonel Harvey Cushing, who was a neurosurgeon, and he went on to become Osler's biographer. So the aim of this fellowship at the time was to support developing civilian training. They started with an emergency postgraduate course just in the first 3 months after they got going, working out which institutions would allow people to attend lectures, go to outpatient clinics to observe operations, and so on. There was a small fee for doing this, and there was a bulletin published listing all these things. And that bulletin went on to become the Postgraduate Medical Journal. I'm delighted our editor, Professor Chung, is here from Hong Kong you'll hear a bit from him later on today. And this journal continues as an international journal. And in terms of early influence, the fellowship encouraged London and regional teaching hospitals to develop and maintain courses, and supported the creation of what became a purely postgraduate medical school, initially as the British and then the Royal Postgraduate Medical School in West London at the Hammersmith Hospital. Now, thinking about the medical postgraduate education scene in London over the subsequent decades, a federation was eventually formed which included this postgraduate school, but also 13 specialist institutes linked to major teaching hospitals. This eventually evolved into regional deaneries around the UK supporting specialist training, and these more recently were incorporated into Health Education England to have a very structured approach to training and education. And what about the FPM, the spirit of Osler, postgraduate training, working in medical societies, working with your colleagues? The organization ran courses for 6 decades. In the 80s and 90s, moved on to develop a European medical research grouping, which met 5 times a year with a key speaker and poster presenters, juniors who were on fellowships from around the world in London. It had partnerships with a number of organizations, including the clinical tutors, as well as those focused on education, for example, a center at UCL. In the 2000s, new partnerships have been developed, and we also have a new journal, Health Policy and Technology. You'll be able to meet the editor and our team at the table up in the Osler room. And Ken Redicott, our editor, is here from Rotterdam today. As a flavour of some of our recent activity, here are the themes of some of our recent conferences. Immunopsychiatry, a hot topic in terms of psychiatric disease, organised by Tim Nicholson, our secretary. We had an anniversary for the Postgraduate Journal 4 years ago, meeting in Harvard supported, meeting on health policy. We supported a session in Hong Kong, organised largely by Bernard Chung and his colleagues, at the university there. We had a centenary for our own organisation a year ago. We've had meetings on European cooperation in healthcare, trying to be positive about the world possible, world post some sort of Brexit. And we now have the conference here. And for my last pair of slides, Osler was very keen on medical humanities. He thought you should be rounded. He would also look at people who were outside the scientific rational world and encourage them to think about what was rational. So he would charge humanists for being ignorant about medical matters and also scientists for neglecting the humanities. And with that background in mind, the fellowship for the last 10 years has supported a major international initiative bringing together poetry and medicine. It's used originally to help psychiatric patients, but it's used in many ways to help a whole range of patients in different ways, formally or informally, as well as to support aspects of medical education. And through this award, supported by the FPM, there have been over 10,000 entries from 70 countries with conferences in the UK, the States, Harvard and Chicago. There's one coming up in Oviedo in Spain next year, and a further one in Australia, Sydney, in 2 years' time. And for the future, we plan further workshops and conferences. We have a new associate member category, and we're also launching some new international awards for the best of reliable, safe, trusted writing by doctors in social media. So without more ado, I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you.